Micah is one of my favorite prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, he has penned some of the most powerful and famous verses that exist throughout the Bible. You just heard one of them from Tom as he was reading and playing the piano. Micah 6:8, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? I mean, it's quite simple, but it packs such prophetic power. But that's not the only famous verse that Micah has to offer. Every year, when we get around Christmas time, we hear from Micah in chapter 5. He says these words, "But you, O Bethlehem, from you shall come forth one who will rule Israel, and he will feed his flock in the strength of the Lord." I mean, it's Micah who steers our eyes towards Bethlehem in expectation of the Christ child. I mean, Micah is an incredible prophet. I mean, who doesn't love Micah? You know, my relationship to Micah reminds me a lot of my relationship to, well, pop songs. If you were to ask me in high school, Patrick, what do you think about Billie Jean by Michael Jackson? I'd say, love Billie Jean. Favorite pop song of all time. And yet, I could only actually sing maybe 2 lines from Billie Jean, kind of like I could only recite maybe 2 lines from the book of Micah. But every time it would come on, I would just get in it. Once that bass line started, I'd start moving my body, couldn't help it. I start doing the Michael Jackson walk and stuff, and then that riff starts, that You know what I'm talking about, can you hear it? And then once the word starts, I could erupt knowing that one lyric. She was more like a beauty queen from a movie scene. And then right after that, my voice would just kind of trail off into a low mumble, not really knowing what's being said. But then we'd get to the chorus and I'd just shout out, "Billie Jean's not my lover." But that's really all I had to offer in terms of knowledge of the lyrics. But it was my favorite pop song. So notice what's going on. It's my favorite pop song. I only know 2 lines and I have no clue as to who Billie Jean is, why we're singing about her. Well, when I was in college, I was in the library writing a paper and I had my headphones in and I was just listening to a playlist and Billie Jean comes on. And so I'm looking for any reason to do something other than write my paper. And so I just Googled the lyrics to Billie Jean. And what I discovered was quite a tortured tension in the story of the song. I mean, it starts out about Billie Jean, we know that, more like a beauty queen from a movie scene, and she invites MJ onto the dance floor. They start dancing, but it gets a little hot and heavy, like no room for Jesus between those two. And it starts to cause a scene, and everyone in the room suddenly turns and looks and stares at what's going on between Billie Jean and MJ, and some of the people in the crowd are wishing that it was them dancing with Billie Jean. Well, you fast forward in the song, and it turns out that Billie Jean has a child and claims that MJ is the father, and then MJ is saying, no, Billie Jean's not my lover. The kid is not my son. And then MJ starts reflecting on the voices that have been around him all the time, giving him advice that you've got to be careful. You can't be this playboy that's going around breaking hearts, that sooner or later it's going to catch up to you and cause trouble. And he even hears the voice of his mom that's telling him that if you're not careful, lies will start to be treated like the truth. They'll get traction. And then we see that the courts are involved and it sides with Billie Jean, that the kid is his son. And then finally, Michael sees a picture of his son and sees that the kid's eyes are like his. And then from then on in the song, he starts calling the baby my baby. And so the reality is slowly sinking into MJ. This is my son. Oh my goodness, what am I going to do? But yet the chorus keeps going on. Billie Jean's not my lover. I mean, whew. There's a lot going on in this song. And as I read that in the library, it kind of rocked my world. It never had the heaviness. I just kind of would just do the dance and be lighthearted with it. You know, I think that the book of Micah, there's a lot going on in there. If you look past the 2 verses that are so famous, we might just discover something that still has the power to rock our world. Oh, it's worth diving in and learning the lyrics of this ancient Hebrew poet. So let's take a look together. So who is Micah? Micah is one of the earliest agrarian poets history knows. Micah lived in the 8th century before the Common Era in the southern kingdom of Judah. It's the same time period during which you would encounter other prophets you may have heard of: Hosea, Amos, Isaiah. But really, it's the poetry of Hosea and Amos that inspired the prophetic work of Micah. You see, Hosea, Amos, and Micah, they are the prophetic cry that comes from the rural communities of Israel and Judah. They are the ones who speak for the communities that have a kind of regional network of subsistence farming. People are farming not to make a living, but to live. And yet, that dynamic, that sacred relationship with the land began to be disrupted in the 8th century BCE. And it's no wonder that you see the prophetic cries come from these rural prophets like Hosea, Amos, and Micah. Now, Isaiah was a little bit different. He was more of a city boy. He lived in Jerusalem. He was on the temple payroll. I mean, the crown was signing his paychecks. But he still was influenced by some of those poets in the rural areas speaking up for the folk who worked the land. Even people like Isaiah were just so cut to the heart by those who had a word from the Lord, who didn't wear robes and stoles like this. People like Micah were the people who wore things like Carhartt jackets and steel-toed boots and had calloused hands because of the hard labor in the field. Hosea, Amos, and Micah, they had to divert their attention away from the flocks and the crops because the economy was starting to shift in ways that were not aligned with the heart of God. And so their poetry erupts out of this change. Here's what's going on. That subsistence level farming in which rural communities had each other's back. It wasn't oriented towards making a buck, but just making a living. Suddenly, those who were in power, the crown in Jerusalem and the wealthy aristocracy in these urban areas, or the landed aristocracy that was in sort of metropolitan areas outside of Jerusalem, they saw an opportunity in their region. You see, their big neighbor, Aram, they were having hard times. That bigger empire, Assyria, that was always threatening, they had to turn their attention to trouble back home. And so these leaders in Judah saw an enormous opportunity, as well as the leaders in the northern kingdom of Israel, that, hey, now's our time to chart our own destiny. Now's the time, if we ever wanted to build a real economy that lined our pockets with cash, let's do it now. Let's get rich. And so the rulers in Jerusalem and Damascus, they started to change the subsistence agriculture in the region and start investing in commodities. They really wanted farmers to grow 3 things: grain, to help feed these urban centers, and also these luxury items that would bring in a load of cash from international trade: olive oil and wine. You see, it was a new way of learning about the land. It wasn't necessarily a sacred trust that we depend on from God as a gift, but it was now a mechanism to make a lot of money. And the people who could work the land, they also were mechanisms to make a lot of money. Not where the wealth would be shared, but that where the richest 1-2%, they would get unimaginably rich. And so the economy was structured in order to make that wealth happen. Now, here's the thing. When you're a farmer in that kind of setting, you would have about 3 years out of 10 that were just terribly awful years in terms of being able to grow enough food for yourself that you could actually live off of. And so if you hit one of those tough years and you could not meet the taxes of grain or olives or grapes that the government was asking for, if you could not produce what the government was telling you you had to produce, then suddenly you had to put up your ancestral land as collateral. And slowly, bit by bit, year after year, the centralized government of Judah would start seizing and annexing the land because of the farmers not being able to keep up with what was demanded of them. And so as they acquired more land and more people who was indebted to the crown, suddenly they had more and more control over the economy and what came up out of the ground, with those who were growing the produce with less and less power to reap the benefits. Do you know about 50% of the productive capacity and labor of an average family farm in Judah at the time was absorbed by the government in order to increase wealth for the crown and the landed aristocracy? It was a time in which there was incredible transformation in the economy that made some people very rich, but it laid waste to the vast majority of the people of Judah. And it's in this context that you start hearing Micah say things like, do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with the Lord. In other words, it is not God's dream of justice for you to use land and people as mechanisms to make a buck for just a few and lay waste to people and families and their generational inheritance of land. It is not God's sense of justice that you just treat the earth as somehow a machine to make money off of, as something that doesn't need love and attention, as something that is precious, that your own life is tied to. And Mike is saying that in order to walk humbly with God, you need to revert this economy and this system of land use and cash flow back to something else, because you're not walking with God right now, you are walking with the devil. And people are hurting. So if you read a little bit past Micah chapter 6, verse 8, you're daring to go into chapter 6, verse 9, this is what Micah says. The voice of the Lord cries to the city. The voice of the Lord cries to the city. Hear, O tribe and assembly of the city. Can I forget the treasures of wickedness in the house of the wicked, and the scant measure that is accursed? Can I tolerate wicked scales and a bag of dishonest weights? Your wealthy are full of violence, and your inhabitants speak lies. Micah says to all that money and all of the luxury that's being soaked up in the city, it is blood money. People are being crushed to make that money. And God isn't having it. So what does the Lord require of you? To do justice. Change your economy, change your practices, change the way that wealth is distributed, change your relation to the land. That's justice. What is kindness? To actually treat people as human beings that are of worth beyond what money they can make. What is walking with God? Not this, something else. Stop doing such violence and calling it a robust economy. You know, it's no wonder Micah dreams of a messianic figure that comes not from Jerusalem, but from that rural town of Bethlehem. One who will rule not like a king who's an economic mind, but rules like a shepherd who cares for his sheep. You know, I wonder if Micah were to be roaming around Lincoln today, what that prophetic voice might say. It's always a dangerous question to ask. If we had a prophetic voice like that in our time and place, what would that voice say? Well, we know if there was a prophet like that, she wouldn't be from Lincoln. No, she'd probably come from like Milford. And if she were to come this way to Lincoln, she might go over to the Capitol building and say, you know what? Our economy, the way agriculture works in our world today, it's not like it did before World War II when small farms seemed to just flourish and be everywhere. No, we have a lot smaller percentage of people who farm, and it's absorbed in an agri-economy that leaves little save for the individual farmers. We don't live off of local food. No, we're in a much wider system that we have very little control over. And yet now when we're in a time of economic slowdown and a pandemic and people are losing jobs, people are going hungry. And yet here is what the government did in Nebraska, the prophet might say. She might say that of all the states in the union, all of the states accepted continued assistance of maximizing SNAP benefits for those who could use it except Nebraska. Nebraska's governor turned down the maximization of SNAP benefits because he wants things to get back to normal. Oh, a prophet like Micah might say here in Lincoln, how could you turn your back on those who are hungry? How could we be so uniquely dismissive of the need? You know, I imagine that Micah might look at our economy as a country and say, you call this the best economy in the history of the world, but you know what I see? I see that out of the $98 trillion of household wealth that exists in America, 90% of it is held by only 1/5 of the population. Out of the $98 trillion of wealth that exists by households in America, the poorest 40% have none of it or at least $6,000 of debt. Oh, I think the prophetic voice of Micah says, you might call that an economy, but I call it not walking with God, but walking with the devil. It is making money for a precious few at the cost of the many. Oh, if Micah were here or a prophetic voice like him was here, I think that prophetic voice might say, you know what? We've learned in a pandemic that the most essential workers in our midst make the least amount of money. Those working at grocery stores, serving at restaurants, the people who are teaching our kids in schools, the people working our meat packing facilities. They are the ones who are putting their lives on the line, and yet we pay them a mere pittance compared to what other people in other lines of work make. I think Micah might say to us, pay people what they're worth. At the very least, pay them a living wage. Treat them like they're people of value and not try to squeeze another buck off of cheap labor. Well, I think if there was a prophetic voice like Micah in our midst, she might be pointing to the wildfires in the West and the very active hurricane season so early. It might be saying, screaming at us that we cannot, with an addiction to fossil fuels, continue to crush our earth and kill it all so that we can keep making money off of oil. It's not walking humbly with God. It is walking with the almighty dollar and laying waste to human beings and the precious earth that is a gift from God that we need. Well, Micah might have something to say to us. But my friends, here's the good news. Micah believed it was still possible for us as individuals and as communities to do what the Lord requires, to do justice, to love kindness, and have the kind of world that shows we walk humbly with God. We value people and we value the earth. God's love can still be at work in you to rock this world. Let's do what the Lord requires. Amen.